This is episode 38 of Bible Mechanics. And on this episode, I'm going to do the next few episodes on the subject of the structure of the Bible. And this is a big part of Bible mechanics, how it came together, and therefore how you read it, how you understand it. The Bible is a book, sure. Look at it. How can I see this and say it's not a book? It's a book. It's obviously a book. But it's more like a library than it is like a book. It's like if you took 66 small books and you put them in one binding, that's a small library. So that's what this is. And it reads like that because you got different authors. Some authors wrote more than one book, but Moses, for example, wrote the first 5 books. But you've still got, several dozen authors. You got 66 distinct texts. So that's the first thing to understand about how it's put together. It was written by a lot of different authors. And authors who sometimes knew each other and sometimes didn't. It was written over a period of the Old Testament was written over a period of about roughly 1,000 years. Moses wrote about 1500 BC. Last book of the Old Testament was written about 500 or 400 BC. So roughly 1,000 years to write the Old Testament. And the New Testament was written in 100 years. So that's the first thing to understand about the structure of the Bible is it's divided into 2 testaments, 2 sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. That wording coming from the word covenant, which means a relationship that involves promises and duties of one party to another party, very much like a marriage. Covenant is like a marriage. So the Old Covenant was the covenant between God and the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, the Old Covenant was the covenant for the ancient nation of Israel. And the New Covenant is between God and man. It applies to all human beings. But I don't want to get pulled away into the different, the meaning of the Bible. I want to focus on the mechanics. So, for example, when I first came to the Bible, I had very limited knowledge of it. I'd been raised Roman Catholic, so I was kind of aware of it, familiar with some of the names. They would read portions of the Bible, small portions, during the Mass that Catholics are required to attend. And I went to Mass, probably, once I was going to school. I was going to Mass once a week, I guess, once I was born. And then once I started going to elementary school, it was parochial school. So I was going 5 days a week and going to Mass every one of those 5 days. And then my mother usually took us to confession on Saturday afternoons. So that was the 6th day. And then, of course, there was Sunday. So, from the 1st to the 6th grade, I was going to church 7 days a week. And, after that, once I got to junior high, had a little freedom of movement. You could drive a car when you were 14 back then, at least during the day. And I got away from it then and became an agnostic. So that's a story that I tell elsewhere. But that's all the knowledge of the Bible I had. So when I went to read it at roughly age 26, I knew I wanted to start with the New Testament. Or if I didn't know that, I found out pretty quickly. But the New Testament is much shorter. So let's stay on the mechanics. The New Testament is much shorter than the New Testament, about 1/4 the size. There's 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 in the New, for a total of 66. Now that's the standard Protestant Bible. Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, which are the other 2 main branches of institutional Christianity, have a few more books in the Old Testament, but they have exactly the same New Testament. And the books are not uniform size, Some are a whole lot longer than others. Some are very short. There are a few Bible books that are just one chapter long, basically one page. And then some books which are very long. Psalms, you got 150 different Psalms. Isaiah's got 66 chapters. So a lot of variation in the size of each book. And because you got different authors, you got different styles of writing. And even with the same authors, they write books of different styles, because some of them are books about history. Some of them are books of wisdom or reflection on that history. And in the New Testament, you have letters that are written, Gospels, which are a sort of biography of Jesus. So lots of variety in the style of writing, lots of variety in the genre or the type of writing it is. And in the Old Testament, you've basically got books written in Hebrew, because it's a book for the Hebrew nation, ancient Israel. In the New Testament, you've got books that were written in Greek, which was the lingua franca of the known world at that time. Israel sits at the intersection of three major continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And the language chosen to write these documents in was the language that most people were using at that time. Just as most people speak English in the world today, most people spoke Greek at that time. So in terms of number of pages or number of words, the Old Testament is about 3 times as large as the New Testament. But I would encourage you to familiarize yourself first with the New Testament. For one reason for that is that most of us are not Jews, and we're certainly not ancient Jews. No one's an ancient Jew. Even modern Jews aren't ancient Jews. And that's who the Old Testament was written for. Now, modern Jews may say, well, it applies to us too. Well, that's okay, but that doesn't apply to most people. That's the second factor. Most of us are not Jews, and so, but more importantly than that, the New Testament gives us the interpretive key to the Old Testament. And that's why we should read the New Testament first. It's the lens through which we should view the Old Testament. If you read this, that's another reason why you should consider this a library and not a book, because if you read it like a book, you read it left to right. And that you'll see is the beginning to the end. And there's a sense in which you can find coherence in it, but you're not going to get the spiritual value unless you read it from the New Testament first. And the reason for that is because the New Testament contains the thinking of Jesus of Nazareth. And he was a Jew, and he was an ancient Jew, and he was the one whose interpretation of the Old Testament we are interested in, because it's his interpretation of the Old Testament that shows how it applies to us. So that'll be our first lesson. We see the Bible is structured between 2 testaments, 2 different languages, directed to 2 different peoples, and one, the shorter one, being greater in that it is the key to understanding the New Testament. The only person I've ever heard of who understood the Old Testament before they understood the New Testament is Jesus himself. Because as I said earlier, the New Testament is just a reporting of his interpretation of the Old Testament. So I hope you enjoyed that start, and I hope you'll let me help you walk through more Bible mechanics and more about the structure of the Bible next time.